So on February 26, 1993, Ramzi Youssef and some other terrorists carried out the bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City. They intended for that bomb to bring down both towers and to kill thousands of people, but that didn't happen. As you may know, it wasn't until years later that Youssef's uncle masterminded the 9/11 attacks, which did, of course, bring down both towers and kill thousands of people. On this day in February 1993, 6 people were killed and more than 1,000 people injured. And my friend Andrew, he was a bigwig at the time on one of the top floors of one of those towers, and he tells me the story of what it was like to realize that a bomb had just exploded several floors beneath him. And he tells me the story of what it was like to rush down to the bottom floor and to run outside and be consumed with mass chaos and confusion and pain and suffering and tragedy. And he immediately ran into the chaos and started pulling these injured bodies out. He even remembers which suit he was wearing that day. And he tore his suit off and he started using these pieces of fabric as bandages for the bleeding and the suffering. You see, for Andrew, it is a day that will be seared in his mind and heart. He's not likely to forget this day ever, even the details. And see, when Andrew was living in New York City and working on the stock exchange, he lived a pretty fast-paced lifestyle. It was one that included lots of drugs and lots of booze and lots of women. And now I want you to fast forward with me in his life up to about 3 years ago. Andrew surrendered. He got clean and sober. He discovered that God was doing for him what he could not do for himself. He had this spiritual awakening. And Andrew is a very different person now. You know, last year he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctors gave him a death sentence. He's got an 11-year-old boy at home. And see, for me, Andrew is kind of like a spiritual guru in my life because, see, every time I talk to Andrew, he's talking about gratitude and how good God is, even in the midst of getting this death sentence. So a few months ago, I called Andrew. And I said, dude, I've had this incredible opportunity over the past couple of years to go down to the Florence maximum security prison and to spend time with those guys. And I've grown to love those guys. By the way, that came out of this storyline process 5 years ago. Side note. But I said, man, it's just been an incredible opportunity for me, and it's so rewarding and so transformative. I've grown to love them. And, dude, I think if you came down with us, I think you would grow to love these guys too. And I just know they would benefit from your story and being able to spend time with you. So would you consider it? And with no hesitation at all, he said, yeah, I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do it. I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm a little scared, but I'm learning now in my life to say yes to the opportunities that God is giving me. So, later in February, they went down to the Florence maximum security prison. I couldn't join them because just a couple of days before, we had a baby boy come into the world. But they went, and I called Andrew later that day, and I said, Andrew, man, I've been thinking about you all day. How'd it go? He said, dude, it was just so incredible. I mean, to be there with these 120 or so guys in maximum security prison, and I mean, just so incredible. And I shared my story with them, and they shared their stories with me, and we laughed together. We cried together, and they were so polite to me, and they had so many questions. And I said, dude, I am so glad you went. He said, yeah, but Ryan, that's not all. Do tell. He said, well, as we were walking out after being there for a couple hours, we were walking down the path back to the main facility to which we were just going to get in our cars and go home. But some of the prison officials invited us into the Supermax. What? People don't get invited into the Supermax. I mean, people go there, but they don't exactly come out, if you know what I mean. If you're not familiar with the Supermax in Colorado, well, it is the only Supermax in the entire world. It is where people who have committed the most heinous crimes imaginable are being held. Many of the names there are familiar in American culture. You would know many of these names. A quick Google search could tell you who's there. So, I said, dude, did you go? Yeah, we went. Yeah. His exact words. Because God was leading us. He said the whole way walking across this campus to the Supermax, I was praying, God, your will, not mine be done. God, your will, not mine be done. God, your will, not mine be done. And then we walked into this facility. Tons of security measures. And there was 7 inmates in this Supermax sitting in a half circle. And again, he said, Ryan, it was just so incredible to be with these guys. And I shared with them my whole story, even going back to 1993 and being in that bombing in the Twin Towers and how that impacted my life and my fast-paced lifestyle and finding God and gratitude and forgiveness and what it's like to be given a death sentence and what it's like to be locked up in here and to be set free. I said, dude, how powerful. He said, yeah, but that's not all. Do tell. As we were walking out, after spending an hour with these guys in the Supermax, the guard said to me, Andrew, man, your story was really powerful, especially the part about the 1993 bombing in the Twin Towers. He said, do you know what made it so powerful? No, tell me. And the guard said to Andrew, out of the 7 men sitting in that half circle, do you know who the guy in the middle was? And Andrew said, no, I didn't recognize him from Adam. Who was he? And the guard looks at him and says, that was Ramzi Youssef. Andrew is from New York. So he talks loud and he talks fast like they do. And he's on the phone with me and he starts shouting, Ryan, do you see what happened here? I mean, do you see what happened? I got to talk about God and gratitude and forgiveness and a death sentence with the man who tried to kill me 26 years ago. And then he gets even more animated and he says, Ryan, God was leading us. God was leading us. God did this. God did this. God did this. And I'm saying, I know. You see, Andrew is open to God redeeming the negative terms in his life. Are you open? Are you willing to let God in to redeem the dark terms, the tragedy, the pain? Because the truth is, we all have stories, and all of our stories consist of these very positive and negative turns. And in my experience and observation, and by the way, when it comes to a story turn, we learn this in the storyline process. A story turn is a thing that happens in your life, an event that after which you will never be the same. You can think of it as a doorway, that once you walk through this doorway, there's no going back. Now, we all have the positive and negative turns. And again, in my experience and observation, when it comes to the positive turns, well, we're not exactly struggling, are we? I mean, I don't encounter very many people who say, man, I just don't know what to do with that celebration, or that graduation day, or that day that I got married and it was so good, or the day I held my baby boy and watched him take his first breath. There's an intuition inside of us that kind of knows what to do with this. We offer thanks, and God, you are so good. But what do you do with the negative ones? The ones that consist of pain, loss, grief, uncertainty. What do you do with those? Are you willing to let God in? And when we talk about redemptive perspectives, that's a storyline term. When we talk about these, we're not talking about making the negative positive. We're not talking about ignoring the real tragedies and just trying to make good in it all. But we are looking for ways in which we might bring meaning to the pain. But to experience redemptive perspectives, we have to be willing to explore. And see, think about the most inspiring people in your life. Isn't it people who are able to articulate and even live out things like grace and compassion and forgiveness and gratitude and all the other things we long for, to live those things out in the midst of the negative turn and the redeeming of the negative turn? But see, we have to be willing to explore and own our stories. Brene Brown, one of my favorite researchers and authors, says that owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. Now, one of the ways that we own our stories is to simply tell our stories, which is why I think the storyline process is so impactful, because we're sitting around in either living rooms or church classrooms or coffee shops, wherever it may be, and sharing our stories together. And I get it. This kind of vulnerability and sharing your story can be really difficult. And I think there's something that tends to hold us back in sharing, and I think that thing is shame. Because, see, shame hates it when you reach out and tell your story. Shame will come along and tell you all kinds of lies. Shame will come along and say, well, I can't tell them that. Because if I tell them that, then I might not belong. And I can't share this with them because they'll lose respect for me. And I can't tell them that because I might look weak. And I can't let them in here because if they get in here and they know what's really in here, well, they might not like me. Or worse, they might not want me. And you see, shame comes along and it always tries to convince me to protect my ego at all costs. But my brothers and sisters, I am absolutely convinced that if we let God in, the work of God is about redeeming those negative turns, bringing something meaningful out of that pain. Now, in our storyline groups, it is the process of telling our stories, of letting God in, and also letting others in. And it can be a great act of vulnerability. It can be a great act of courage. But time and time again, I see it. When you share your story, it has a way of saying that the pain, the suffering, the tragedy, these things do not have the final word. Do you believe God has a purpose for your story? Do you believe that God wants to use your story, all of it? Not just the good parts, not just the celebratory moments, but all of it. All the pieces that shame tells you to keep in. All the pieces that have come along and created pain in your life. Do you believe God wants to use all of it? So think with me for just a moment about the story of Joseph. Going back to Genesis. We've been in Genesis for 3 weeks now. The last time Joseph saw his brothers, they had just beaten him to a bloody pulp. They threw him into a pit, and they sold him off to a slave in Egypt to some passerbys. Joseph is now the most important person in Egypt next to Pharaoh. So we're in Genesis 45. Decades have gone by. There's a famine in the land. Joseph's brothers, the ones who sold him into slavery, are now coming to Joseph, this very powerful leader, and they're asking for food. They're begging for food. But here's the thing. When they get to Joseph, they don't recognize him. Decades have gone by, but he recognizes them. And what a moment this could be, because Joseph could crush his brothers. Joseph could lay into them. Joseph could torment them the way they did to him. But talk about a redemptive perspective. Here's how Joseph responds. Genesis chapter 45, 1 through 7. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come closer to me. And they came closer. He said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold to Egypt. Now don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves that you sold me here, because actually God sent me before you to save lives. God sent me before you to make sure you'd survive and to rescue your lives in this amazing way. In other words, Joseph is saying, this pain, this thing that you did, this negative turn, it doesn't control me anymore. And I know what you all did. I know you meant it for evil. I know you meant it to harm me. But listen here, my brothers. God had bigger plans here. God was doing something else. Are you open? Are you willing to let God in to redeem the dark turns, the tragedies, the pain? You see, because something really beautiful happens when you have experienced a particular kind of suffering, and then you go to someone who is going through that same kind of suffering, and you say to them, yeah, me too. Yeah, I've been there. I know what that's like. I mean, it's kind of like a backpack, isn't it? Moments of failure, abuse, betrayal, that divorce, that hard thing you went through, that diagnosis, that tragedy that you went through. You see, all these things, they just become another burden to carry, and soon the thing gets so heavy. I mean, the backpack that you're carrying, it can weigh a ton, can't it? And in your journey, you get more tired and more weary until you actually open up this thing and you find out what's inside. You discover what's in here, and you find things like food. You find things like water. And when you actually start to go through it and you own your story, you discover that there are things in here that you have been carrying around that other people need for their journey. The thing that has been weighing you down. I mean, yeah, you went through that traumatic thing and it was awful, but now you get to go to other people and say, yeah, I've been there, and I'm still here. The very thing that was weighing you down is now the exact thing through which God's healing love flows to somebody else. That was quite a closing. You discover that the thing that has been the biggest source of pain in your life is now a source of joy to help others. Are you open? Are you willing to let God in to redeem the dark turns, the tragedies, and the pain?